afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sumita Karir, and you're watching this special broadcast from ET Now on Donald Trump's tariff policy. The U.S. president has escalated trade tensions with India. He's vowed to substantially raise tariffs. In fact, in a fiery Truth Social post, Trump accused India of profiting off Russian oil while ignoring the Ukraine war toll. Remember, this is coming in days after he slapped a 25% tariff penalty, citing India's high duties and Russian deals. Let's listen into what Donald Trump had to say on sanctions against Russia.
Well, there'll be sanctions, but they seem to be pretty good at avoiding sanctions. You know, they're wily characters, and they're pretty good at avoiding sanctions. So we'll see what happens. But Steve is focused right now on the border in terms of, we're talking about with Gaza, getting people fed. And he may be going, I think next week, Wednesday or Thursday, may be going to Russia. They would like to see him. They've asked that he meet, so we'll see what happens.
Well, that's Donald Trump speaking about India's energy trade with Russia. But after maintaining a strategic silence, India has now hit back at criticism from the United States and European Union over Russian oil imports. In fact, India has called out criticism from the United States and EU as unjustified and unreasonable. This was shared in a strongly worded statement last night by the Ministry of External Affairs, which claimed that India turned to Russian crude only after traditional suppliers were redirected to Europe, and that's a move that the US initially encouraged. In fact, this statement, if you see the fine print of the statement, it essentially points in specific terms to West's hypocrisy over trade with Russia. The MEA stated that Western nations themselves continue deep trade with Russia, from LNG to uranium, and of course that makes the criticism hypocritical. But now that even as India is holding its ground, what's going to be the reaction from the United States as far as these recent statements by India are concerned? To discuss that and more, I'm now joined by Veena Sekhri, Indian former High Commissioner to Bangladesh. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us here on ET Now. In fact, I'm given to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to US and Germany, is also joining us. Let me take the first question from you, Ms. Sekhri. Your first thoughts on India's response to the United States and EU's criticism last night. Was it imperative at this point for India to respond, given the volley of attacks by the United States on India's energy trade with Russia?
Well, I think India's response has been very calm, collected and cautious. We are actually continuing all the different aspects of the Indo-US relationship, which are very dynamic and well-developed. As you know, the NISAR, ISRO, NASA satellite was launched just last week, and talks on IMEC are continuing, and so many aspects are continuing. But I think our government statement last night, this was a very correct and appropriately timed statement, because it's put the entire picture, it put all the facts in the correct perspective. And we've said that we are buying Russian oil, to meet affordable and predictable supplies of energy for our people, and also in full discussion with the American and EU governments. In fact, as you know, much of the crude that comes to India is refined and then it goes to the European Union. And the other part, the second point, the most important point that our statement has made is that we know that USA has an equally dynamic trade, ongoing trade with Russia. I think somebody was telling me $1 billion in the last 8 to 10 months, whether it's uranium or palladium or titanium or fertilizers. Many products are being imported by the USA from Russia. Similarly, the EU and Russia, they have a very dynamic trade relationship. A lot of Russian crude gets refined and goes from India, but they have a direct trade with Russia. So all these factors concerned, I think we're in the proper perspective. And I think that, I hope that, things will go back to normal, and this question of penalties is not there as it is on the 25% tariffs. We are going to continue with the negotiations. Later in August, the team is coming. So I hope that it will all tide over and good explanations will be accepted and carried out.
Well, we do hope, ma'am, given the fact that India-US ties have remained resilient, has been cooperation in defense, technology, clean energy partnerships have been key to this, strong partnership that India and the United States have enjoyed. Ms. Shankar, let me come to you, and thank you for patiently waiting. Has the recent invective by Donald Trump brought about an inflection point for India and US ties? And what's Donald Trump's strategy on India with respect to his second administration?
Look, I think Donald Trump's strategy towards India is part of his overall strategy to, as he says, make America great again. Now, the economic policies he's choosing for that may not make America great again. In fact, the American economy is somewhat shaky, but all his trading partners have faced the brunt of Trump's new trade policies, which he's putting into place in his second administration. In the first administration, it was targeted mainly at China. Now you're seeing across the world that Trump is putting tariffs and targeting even his closest allies in asymmetric trade deals. For India, I think our relationship with the US is important, but it's also important for us to ensure that in seeking to continue talks with the US, we hold on to our red lines, particularly in areas such as agriculture. Now, if you see the US trade deals with Japan or with Europe, they have not been based on either Europe or Japan opening up their agriculture across the board to the US. So India too should ensure that, there are items that we can buy from the US, but we can't open up agriculture across the board because our farmers are really subsistence farmers with farms of less than 2 acres, actually, most of them. So they survive on this, and it's almost 50% of our population. So it would be difficult for any government to do something which makes these people vulnerable and could lead to significant turmoil within India. Having said that, as I said, both countries are continuing discussions, and India's approach should be one which is neither aggressive nor obsequious. I think that is important. We need to keep our interests in mind. At the same time, we should be pragmatic and continue discussions to see if something is possible. The other area, which is a relative sticking point, flows from President Trump's change of policy with regard to Ukraine and Russia, because when he came in, he wanted a trade deal. He wanted a peace deal, with Russia and Ukraine, and said he would get a ceasefire in 24 hours. That has not been the case. Putin is proving a harder nut to crack than he imagined because he's holding out for a long-term peace deal. So Trump's frustrations are now being felt through his threat of secondary sanctions on countries like India and China, which buy oil from Russia. But as Veena said, Europe itself has more trade with Russia last year in 24 than India had. It's over $65 billion, near $67 billion, and also has services trade. Your US is importing strategic minerals from Russia, including uranium, palladium, titanium, for their nuclear program, for defense, for EVs. They're importing fertilizers. So it's not as though there's been a complete cutoff. So suddenly, if you have a change of policy, you can't expect other countries to jump or start criticizing them because of it. I think one thing is very important. During the Cold War, the US had if you are not with us, you are against us policy. In recent years, they have broadened their ability to deal with ambiguity, recognizing that most countries cannot make these kind of totally, black and white choices, because they need to deal with a range of countries for development, for imports, for exports, etc., for technology. And India is one of those. So if the US actually goes back to this, black and white world of if you are not with us, you are against us, then I think it can put pressure on the relationship, which I hope it won't. And I do hope
Right.
that both countries will
Right.
be able to find reasonable ways of handling their differences, which respect the interests of both sides. It can't be totally asymmetric.
Absolutely. But Ms. Shankar, let me ask you, things haven't really been, for at least for the United States, been on best terms on the China front. The Philippines is considering another set of talks with the United States on their trade deal. And policy experts have been speaking for a while about the formation of this Russia-China-India axis. Do you see that forming as a serious counterweight to the United States?
Look, India has not joined blocs, in terms of making strategic choices vis-a-vis one great power or another. We want the flexibility to deal with all the great powers in ways which we think are mutually beneficial and help our economy, help our development, help our security, help our technical capacities. So I don't think India will choose to, join blocs, either with the US or against the US. But yes, India has been seeking a greater balancing of the global order so that developing countries such as India have more voice in global affairs and institutions of international governance. And on these issues, it's been partnering with a range of countries, including Russia, China, or Brazil, or South Africa, or other developing countries, most of whom have similar concerns and similar approaches. And India will continue, I think, with this approach. We value the relationship with the US, which has been the strongest economic partnership for India, both in terms of trade in goods and services, but also in terms of technical collaborations and in terms of financial collaborations with our companies raising funds in the US market. And similarly, with a lot of portfolio investment flowing in from the United States, though FDI, I believe, continues to be below par and could be really stepped up. Now, there are areas with considerable potential for both sides to concentrate on, areas where India would be happy to trade with the US, like high tech, like defense, like energy purchases, like aeronautics. There's a whole range of areas where there is scope to increase trade between India and the United States. And my recommendation would really be that we should focus on those areas and set aside the points of difference, which are red lines for either side, so that it's possible to have some kind of a temporary trade deal. I think part of the problem was that we began with this great ambition that we are going to do a big comprehensive trade deal with the US.